I am here to give a little progress report and a little update on a resource that I have been compiling for approximately the last 2 years, and which I'm calling the Hanzi Network Dictionary, which is a shape-based and etymologically motivated character decomposition dataset for Hanzi, so for Chinese characters with functional annotations. Let me jump right in and give you a little bit of background information for this effort. The main factor at play here is that, as we have heard in previous talks, Hanzi are compositional. So in the modern Chinese script, there are somewhere between 5 to 10,000 characters in common use. In practice, you can more or less get by at the very low end with 2,000 characters. An educated person in Chinese will probably command about 5,000, maybe 8,000 characters. But the script itself systematically builds up from a smaller number of you could call minimal components, somewhere between 300 and 500. The number is not very clear, and that these components in every single character contribute something local, either a phonetic hint or a meaning or something more complicated. However, this looks really nice as a simplification, but how to decompose specific characters is typically not trivial, and very often it is ambiguous. There are a lot of ad hoc interpretations and mnemonics around, but the problem with these is that they hurt what I consider information economy, and that is to reduce the cognitive workload, to come to analysis, come to interpretations where components have more or less a stable contribution. So if you have managed to understand the typical contribution of a particular component, then it will help you predict the pronunciation / interpretation of further new characters. And in order to get to these ideal or most practical decompositions, I have found that it is useful to consider historical evidence. So this is what the etymology in the title stands for, which is not a very good word for characters, but it's a widely recognized one. So by character etymology, I basically mean looking at historical evidence. So what is ultimately the Hanzi Network Dictionary? It is a digital resource. You can think of it basically ultimately as one large file, if you will. Its aim is to provide a description of the modern script, the script as is currently in use today. But to do that, it chooses decompositions that are historically motivated. And in every single character, the dataset annotates the function of specific constituents. It is not only a purely text-based resource, but it also includes the actual shapes extracted from a particular Chinese font. So it points to the visual realization of specific constituents in the vector graphical image of each character. It is a strict, so it's a machine-readable format, but it's very expressive to be able to cope with all the different, often non-standard situations. I made the decision to treat the simplified and the traditional Chinese scripts as a single system, not as two distinct scripts. And very important, I'm not doing original research into character evolution, character history. This is a scribal effort. I'm looking at readily available sources to compile this data set. I've made a few key choices along the way, some of which might seem contradictory, but they are not. So the resource is actually not focused on the evolution of characters, what is typically called character etymology. But the way the decompositions that are chosen are motivated by the historical evidence. Although it is a machine-readable data set, ultimately, it is intended for human consumption, maybe not as itself, but as the basis of further artifacts, such as either a print or a digital character dictionary, or the graph of which you saw a screenshot in the previous screen, or other products. And finally, I do prioritize depth over breadth. So we often hear numbers that are up to 50,000, etc. Hanzi currently recognized. I'm covering approximately 9,500 characters, which should be basically amply enough for students of the language and educators. Next, I'm going to share a few observations real quick, which contributed to the way the formalism has turned out to be. So one observation is of a specific item, its reading or meaning as a character is not the same when it occurs as a component. So for instance, the one at the top, the modern current meaning of the word that is written by this character is an inch or very short, but when it occurs as a component, it basically is used to represent a hand. A single component in a particular character locally can have multiple contributions. So in the character here, the part on the right contributes both phonetic information and meaning as its interpretation of a newborn baby and an amniotic fluid. Not everything that you can physically observe in a particular character is actually a component. So at the top, that is the character for root, the little horizontal mark is just indicating something. It points out a part of a tree that's the root of the tree. It is not the numeral 1, it's just a mark. Then sometimes, as in the case below, and particularly the part on the left, this character is usually interpreted as a person, that's the one on the right, holding some object or pushing the plow. In any case, the part on the left has a clear interpretation here locally, but it does not recur elsewhere, so it's not meaningful to consider it as a component. It just plays this role here. And this is actually a very, very big factor. In many characters, some components, or what you could call components, are actually empty. They do not contribute, they do not have any function. They contribute neither meaning nor a phonetic hint. The one at the top, the orange part in the traditional form of this character is actually meat, and that has a legitimate contribution in the traditional character. However, in simplification, it turned into this other shape, which stands for night, which means nothing here. The one in the middle is a well-known example. That's the character for pretty or beautiful. The one at the part at the top is basically the component form of sheep, but here it does not stand for sheep. We just know that this somehow evolved into this current form from what it originally was. And that was head ornament. So this probably happened over a longer period of time through normalization and increasing formal coherence in the script. And an example at the bottom is also very, very frequently just through scribal errors or just the way things evolve. Some components just get distorted, if you will, corrupted to look like something else, but this something else is not what they contribute. So in this case, looking at the part at the bottom, seashell is an empty component here. Another important thing to observe is that sound loans in the Chinese script are very prevalent. So this is the character whose modern meaning is to come, but it basically depicts a wheat plant. It is interpreted as the depiction of a wheat plant, and that is the only meaningful interpretation. Whenever we decompose a character and come up with an interpretation, typically this will refer to the original pre-sound loan usage. And very often when the character also has a component function, it is this pre-loan usage that is returned. That is the case in the very first example for the hand or the inch. And now to some of the more radical ideas that I'm taking. It occasionally makes sense to posit that there is a component which is actually not a component. It does not have a Unicode code point. It does not occur on its own, but it systematically recurs and it has a systematically stable contribution so that it makes sense to consider it as a component in its own right. And that is the part on the left, which is the simplification of Luan from many traditional characters. And in the simplified script, on its own, it does not occur, but it has a very stable contribution to a lot of characters. So in my system, this, for instance, is a component in its own right. And then what are traditionally considered as radicals, I find that a very misleading term. So the Chinese equivalent is pushong, are not to be confused with components. I will stop using the term radical. I only put it in scare quotes here because it's a very recognized term. I'm referring to them as the Hanzi heading or the Hanzi index. Um, a couple of examples when a radical is not a component. The one character at the top, it's a single unit, it does not decompose, but is filed under the heading of the one numeral. You just had to pick a part because it's not a heading on its own. The one in the middle, the character on the left slash top is the phonetic component, but the radical of the entire character is just the part on the left. So there are situations where the Hanzi heading of a character is actually not a component in the character itself. In this case, it is sort of a component if you look at it transitively, but not really. And then there's the case at the bottom, which is filed under this Hanzi heading Li, which is to stand, but it is definitely not a component in the character, not even transitively. The part at the top basically derives from a chisel or a torture instrument. And finally, phonetic components, so the sound components, are very often obscure. And there are arguments to say that, well, if they do not contribute phonetic information in the modern script, why designate them as such? So for instance, the character on the left pronounces zu, has this here as the sound component. If you just look at this specific character, yes, it is not a very helpful sound component. But if you look at the script as a system and look at all the characters where this component appears as a phonetic hint, then you see that this is actually pretty systematic. So it's something along the lines of zu, ju, or zu most of the time, sometimes tu, which are very, very related. So you can see that indeed, this is a very useful sound component, and it completely makes sense to annotate it as such, and also to show the systematic relationship. All right, I need to speed up a little, so I will skip this, and I want to go on to show you the workbench. This is a little custom developed tool that I use to annotate my data set. I will leave my presentation and show you a live demo. So what you have in the workbench on the left is basically a list of the characters that I have chosen to annotate. They are ranked by frequency. So I'm not showing the frequency, just the frequency rank. This is a joint list of both simplified and traditional characters. And from two frequency lists, I combined them. And this is a sort of made up joint simplified traditional frequency rank. You can navigate this list in several ways. You can jump to characters that have a specific pinyin phonetic reading. You can filter by status. So I only want to see the ones that I have already confirmed or that are still work in progress. I believe currently there's only one of those. And the really interesting one is that you can pick a component and basically say, I want to see the ones that, excuse me, that contain it as a component. So this is a very useful way to navigate the list. All right, what else do we have here? On the right, basically the area above this line is the working area. This is why the actual annotation happens. At the top are the components that I defined. This is the vector graphical shape of the character. And at the bottom, I have some extra reference information, the CEDICT entry for the character. Excuse me?
You are not sharing your screen.
That is not intentional. Thank you for letting me know. Correct. All right, so I will just continue from here. Let me show, I don't know when the screen sharing actually stopped, but let me show from the moment where I show you how to filter the list, for instance, for characters that in their current decomposition contain a specific component. All right, how do you annotate a specific character? Let me show you that, thank you, Windows, on the example of a particular character, let's say this pin here. So whatever I have annotated so far, I'm just going to remove that. So I'm starting from scratch. And I basically want to add separate components. So there's the component at the bottom. There is I am going to use these to, I'm going to use the entire top at the part exactly, which is one, which is the phonetic component. And I also want to point at this part in the middle because I do need to point it out as the radical, as the Hanzi heading of the character. Now I can specify what each of the components contributes. So one at the bottom, it contributes. You can actually see that elsewhere in the data set, it has been annotated as these pronunciations and this summary as a component slash as a character, or the other way around. In this case, I want to override that in that hint. This actually contributes movement. This one, it's not an actual component. It's just a shape, not even an empty component. I only use it because it is the radical. So let's point to this as the radical. Also, let's point to this as the actual code point for the hand. And the one at the top, I need Luan there. This is a sound component. And there is my reference. So this is how I work in the tool to annotate my data. All right, let me go back to my presentation. And oh, yes, I wanted to show one more thing. Here's a note to myself. There is a free text field for some extra information. There I can write text. And in my text, I can just refer to the components that I annotated above with the simple part 1, part 3. And in just a little bit, I will show you how this will show up in a derived product, which is a character dictionary. All right, so this P1, I have pointed to Luan. With P3, I have pointed to this Poo at the bottom. All right, back to my presentation. Working in this workbench, let me give you a little insight into how I annotate different constituents. And I switched terminology here and I start talking about constituents because of what I mentioned earlier. A lot of things that are worth pointing out in a particular character are not actual components in my interpretation. So I use constituent here as just a broad term of something that is a part of a character and that I annotate. So here is a very simple example. There is a component on the left. There's a speech radical. It contributes meaning. There's this component on the right, which contributes sound. And in the right area, I show you a screenshot from a derived dictionary that is based on exactly this data. Basically, everything here is procedurally generated. So there's no extra handwritten text here on the right. In the composition, because I annotated the part on the left as meaning, and in the entry for the speech radical itself, its component gloss is specified as speech. I get this summary here. Speech is a meaning component. By the way, it is also the character's heading. All right, let's get to the more tricky ones. We have components that are forms. So a component in my system can contribute sound, phonetic information, or some semantic information, which I separate as either form or meaning. In this character, there's basically two hands, one at the top and one at the bottom, passing something from the other. The two components are form components. And the one in the middle, here's an example of an actual empty component. As it looks now, this is actually a roof, but it does not have the function of a roof. It was originally something else. In this character, it just depicts an object. So in this character, I have went from component to shape, and the contribution of this shape is some sort of form. And by the way, it coincides with what in the modern script is typically a roof. Another example of an empty component, of an empty constituent, the one at the top. So the interpretation of Quang is a person holding a torch or a light. The part at the top only occurs here. It does have an interpretation. It is a torch or a light, so it is a shape. It cannot be a component because it does not occur as a unit otherwise. So there is no reference here. And I wanted to show you another kind of non-functional or empty component, and that is the bland part at the top of this character that that evolved or changed shape from a different one, which originally was a sound component. But whatever we see here in this character is just an empty shape that contributes neither sound, nor meaning, nor shape. And that is it. And finally, although I already showed you this when I was working on PN, I can also posit basically just extra shapes, which are nothing in the character, but I need them to point out something about them, maybe in my explanation. Here, I need to mark this part at the top as a shape, as a unit. It doesn't contribute either form, nor is it an empty component, but I do need to mark it because I will want to refer to it as this is the actual radical Hanzi heading of the character, although in this case, the Hanzi heading is not a meaningful component. This is an overview of the different combinations. So you can basically have these flags, these properties. These are sometimes independent of each other, but not completely. So this is an almost complete list of the different combinations that are possible. I will be happy to share this later on. I will not go individually through this table. Don't worry about that. What I want to point out here is that I did not start with these 14 elements. Oh, this is what a particular component can be in a character. This kind of produced itself as I field tested my formalism and checked, oh, what do I actually find in the data set. The final outcome will be some sort of a machine readable file. Currently, it's a JSON one. It might be XML, it doesn't really matter, some sort of a structured data file. This is the vector graphical information for the individual strokes. At the bottom, there's some character level annotation, and in the parts, that's a list of the different parts. This all maps to the fields that you saw in the workbench. The interesting thing is the stroke indexes, they basically refer to this constituent in this particular character is made up of strokes 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. I wanted to mention this specific distinction. So this is maybe the least defensible decision that I made, the distinction in the case of a semantic component that I talk about. Sometimes I say this contributes meaning, sometimes this contributes form. Here are two examples. The person on the left contributes meaning in the character on the left at the top, and in TA, in the character to split. All three of the components basically I consider to contribute form, because this is, if you will, a depiction of a little scene. This is a little bit similar to what tradition names phonetic semantic compounds versus combined ideographs. So far, most of the cases this works, although often the distinction is a judgment call, but I think no harm is done, definitely, because if it turns out in the end that this distinction does not hold up, the two categories can be just merged with zero effort and no information is lost. And then we just have a semantic component. All right, so this is supposed to be a progress report. What is my progress? I have been working on this for a little bit over 2 calendar years, but not continuously. So this is, if you will, a side project. This is not my day job. Currently, my list has about 9,500 characters, of which I have finished, if you will, a bit over 2,000. This includes the 800 most frequent characters in this combined frequency list. I have not checked how many actual simplified characters / traditional characters are covered on their respective frequency lists. And it's difficult to say what is the actual progress, because I actually work the list from top down, going by decreasing frequency, but whenever I encounter a character, I recursively follow all of its components. And the components are very often very low in the frequency list. Sometimes they are not even on the list and I had to add them. And then, of course, I often go sideways and say, okay, what other characters contain this component where I need to revise the inherited annotation? So I branch out a lot. Also, the total number of the items on the list is evolving. And for like speed, I have experienced that I can do a maximum of 1 hour over a day, and then it's impossible to spend any more time with this. And in that hour, I can cover somewhere between 60 and 100 characters. And I'm very interested how many minimal components turn out in the end, but I also don't know that yet. I want to, this is typically comes at the start of a paper, but I want to point to a couple of comparable data sets. Yesterday, we heard about one from Tomohiko Morioka about Chiza. There are two other similar ones. I also want to point to Venlin's character description language. The key difference is these data sets do not annotate function. The ones on the top do not map so directly into the actual shape in the characters. And they tend to focus on apparent decompositions based on shapes and not on the historically motivated decompositions, which I find more useful for minimizing cognitive load. The character description language from Venlin has a complete opposite. It totally focuses on shape. It defines 20 odd strokes and it describes characters in terms of those, but it does not contain basically any functional information beyond maybe the occasional reference to the radical of characters as inherited from the Unihan database. What do I base this work on? Very, very important is Make Me a Hanzi. That's a project where the vector graphical decompositions of characters come from. I directly incorporated into my dataset frequency lists and the Unihan database. So these are what I consider the digital sources, and the ones below I consider the non-structured sources, meaning I refer to them manually. They are not directly incorporated as the basis of my dataset. Of course, in this work, this being a scribal effort, I am limited in that for me, unfortunately, only basically English, occasionally German language sources are available, accessible, although there is a lot more literature in the historical motivation of characters in Chinese. And finally, what can be the uses of this data set? The two orange ones already exist as prototypes. A character dictionary, it is an actual app for a smartphone, and an interactive character graph. And I want to give you a brief demo of these two. I'm going to use a browser to demo this, but you can imagine that this is exactly what the app looks like on a smartphone. So let me input a character. Of course, because I have strokes, I can really easily, so to say, build a character recognition algorithm on top of that. So this is how I input Chow. And then this is what the character looks like in the dictionary. This is a very simple one. If I follow the route to Zhao, the sound component, the very, very exciting part is this is the systemic nature. I have a list, an easily accessible list of, oh, by the way, this item, this glyph is a sound component in all these other characters with these values. And by the way, this is also a meaning or form component in these other ones. I'm not completely sure this is right. These might be unrevised characters. And if I track back and follow the walk component, then I will see maybe this is right, maybe not. It might be a sound component in this one, but it is a very, very well-known meaning / form, a semantic component in all these other characters. And at a glance, I can get an idea of what it contributes. And then let's look at the, actually, let me copy this Chow character. Correct. Let me give you a quick view into the graph. So this is just a neat visualization of the writing system as a system. You can navigate to a specific character. This is the one in the center. And I see, oh, it is made up of these two components. And then recursively, this is made up of this and this other component. Also, this component is made up of this and this. And as I hover over a particular item, you can see that its actual realization in the containing characters is highlighted. And I also show a couple of other containing characters just for context. And of course, by clicking at any of these nodes, I can navigate straight to that item. So I can really look at the Chinese script as a large network and explore it. All right, what other derivative uses are possible? You can easily create a print-based character dictionary, more creative learning tools, if you will, for instance, based on spaced repetition, similar to tools like Skritter, but those only focus on stroke order, and you can introduce meaningful components, even board games, if you will. In more academic outcome, I think this will enable really, really interesting corpus-based research. So for instance, I would really be interested to look at an actual contemporary corpus, maybe something like a Wikipedia dump, and analyze the actual transitive frequencies of components. So you might have a component that is very, very rare in and of itself. Maybe it's not even a character by itself, but it occurs in a very frequent component. So its cumulative frequency is very high. And this would be very useful input, for instance, didactically to create courses for acquiring the script, because you might have counterintuitive decisions. You might want to include a component pretty early on, which in and of itself is a rare one, but it will be very useful because it is actually a part of some very frequent characters. And maybe a data set like this can be a step towards encoding the Chinese script in a truly open-ended fashion, not limited to code points, but as components that you can more or less freely combine and recombine. Thank you very much for attending my talk and your attention. I'm very happy to
thank you very much, Gábor. We are way over time, so let's do just one question. James Myers.
Yeah, just very quickly, your product looks excellent, very useful and interesting. The obvious question, I think, is if the writing system obscured this history over time through natural writing and reading, and modern fluent reader and writers don't know this history necessarily, why do you think the etymology is necessary to put back? It seems like it's an extra thing to learn. You have to learn the characters and the etymology, right? The actual writers themselves didn't think it was important. They got rid of it.
Correct. That's a very good question. I think this is a case where this basically got lost through the learning method, which is really focused on rote memorization. And in some way, this whole project is motivated by my own journey towards acquiring the script. And in my case, rote memorization really does not work. And I have found that these decompositions, in my particular case, genuinely reduce the cognitive workload. So I can make a lot faster progress in making sense of the writing system. So maybe this is a situation where education can genuinely rediscover something and benefit from it. And this is, of course, only necessary in a sort of learning phase. And once this knowledge gets internalized, I think it's natural that all of this etymology is basically forgotten, just as you don't know the explicit grammatical rules of your own language. But I think at one stage of acquisition, this can be a very useful input.
Okay, thank you very much, Gábor.
Thank you.